I recognize that talking about race is not easy. I'm actually thankful that this is on Zoom because I imagine if I was to try to do this in our usual format, it would be a very tense environment. So I'm actually pretty happy that this is in this format, so I can kind of say what I be as honest and transparent as I can, and share something pretty personal, um, and not feel so uncomfortable, or not make anyone else in the room so uncomfortable. So to be clear, the thought of speaking transparently about my personal experience with race and racism is makes me very uncomfortable. It's not something I would want to really ever do. I'm a trauma surgeon. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not even really confident I have the vocabulary for this kind of conversation, but I'm confident that I have a perspective and experience that may be different from a lot of people who are listening. And during this time of unrest, during this time of protest and white coats for Black lives, I felt like it was time for me to get over my discomfort and share transparently. And our goal is really to raise awareness of the impact of racism and bias, stimulate some healthy conversation among members of our department. So I, just to be clear, I asked Dr. Rosengart if I could try to start this conversation. I wasn't compelled to do this. So over the last several weeks, I've had a lot of my white friends and colleagues who reached out to me in person, by text, social media, and just wanted to let me know that they were here for me and that they wanted to listen. And I just want to first say thank you to everyone who did that. And many of you have also probably seen the social media pledges to oppose racism and to hate, excuse me, to oppose racism and hate, and to become allies and to listen. So this word of everyone is saying that we're listening, and I want to listen, I want to learn, but ultimately I have to be willing to be honest for any learning to occur, and that's what this is about. So today I'm going to take off the mask that I usually wear at work. And to be clear, we all wear masks. This isn't something that's unique to me, right? We don't come to work and show our most painful, insecure issues and in the front. We wear a mask. We hide those things, and that's to be functional at work, and that's also just to be tolerable to be around. Nobody wants to be around us every day if we're you know showing the most dysfunctional, the most difficult parts of our lives. And any Black person, particularly, probably wears a mask in their professional life pretty consistently to hide the pain and the frustration and really just the psychological burden that racism is adding to their lives. This is really eloquently described in a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, where he describes why we wear this mask and what's underneath the mask. And the problem with these masks is if we never take them off, no one can really see the pathology that's hidden. People might assume that we're okay, but we're not. And someone might think, racism can't be that bad. I know this Black guy at my job. He wakes up every morning, goes for a run. He comes to work. He smiles. He's always in a pretty good mood. He's got, living the American dream with a wife and two lovely kids. And I really don't feel like racism is an issue because, if you live your life like that, it doesn't impact you. And I'm here to tell you that if that is your perception of me or of any Black person it's an illusion. And truthfully speaking, racism injures Black people so consistently that we start to normalize it after a while. It just becomes something we expect, and it impacts the depth and the quality of the relationships that we can have with almost every person in our life. Now, I have to admit, I've only had a handful of those aggressive, overtly racist threats or attacks in my life. I can remember one time when I was in medical school and I was driving with my girlfriend. I didn't know the state of Maryland very well, so we stopped at a gas station in a town maybe we shouldn't have stopped in. And and some people yelled some things that were not very nice to us. And while those events are awful and they're terrifying, I have really avoided most of that type of racism by not stopping places like that. And I feel like that kind of racism is hopefully becoming more uncommon due to our culture changing, and also to the legal ramifications of hate crimes. But it's actually the less overt and insidious, sort of pervasive racial bias that sort of slowly eats at my self-worth. It's racial bias that makes me feel despised as soon as I take off this white coat and I go to the grocery store or the park or the bank. God forbid I'm wearing a hoodie because it's cool out. It's really racial bias that's dehumanizing. You know, when I get on an elevator and I have the doors closed and I see the other occupant trembling in fear. You know, on the one hand, I want to offer to say something meek and pleasant to assure them that I'm not a threat. You know, I'm not a monster. But part of me is frankly infuriated that I have to mitigate the effect of my black skin on that person's amygdala. You know, how is this my problem? It's frustrating and it's exhausting. And like I said, it's my normal. It's just something I expect to deal with every day. If you're listening to the sound of my voice and you're saying to yourself, well, I'm not racially biased, so this doesn't really apply to me. Let me remind you what Dr. Cha taught us. Unconscious bias is normal conditioning of our brains from experiences, from messages, from images. We're all conditioned. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person if you have racial bias. It's normal. We all should have racial bias. I have racial bias. I've gotten the same conditioning as everyone else on this call about Black people that you have. I've, of course, taken very active steps to unlearn and suppress those biases because I have to do that to feel confident, to be able to, you know, be successful at work. Despite that, you know, my racial bias even causes me to doubt my own professional value. I mean, that's what imposter syndrome really is. You know, I have to engage in self-talk and seek out supportive friends to combat these negative thoughts. So if my mind is full of this conditioning that I don't want to be conditioned to think that think that all Black people have you know, are violent or scary or inferior. If my mind is full of this unwanted conditioning, how much more is the mind of someone who really has nothing to gain by mitigating it? How much more bias is there if you're completely unconscious to the fact that you have that bias? And actually, it's really those folks who are unconscious who hurt me the most. I really don't concern myself with conscious racists. If you decided that Black people should suffer, I just sort of, you know, write that off as just somebody who I'm not going to really become close to. But it's unconscious racism that really hurts the most, because the racism was unintentional, but it injures the relationship, my self-worth, my value. It's just a little bit more indignity every day. And the stories of these microaggressions and unintentional slights is really unending in professional life, including academic surgery. And while that deserves attention, and I think it's something that we should attend to as a department, I want to shift focus right now to more than just the emotional harm of racial bias. I want to talk about the actual physical danger that racial bias puts Black people in. And in my opinion, this is a public health threat that needs to be addressed right now by physicians of all types, in particular trauma surgeons. And we have a very special guest here to discuss how racial bias impacted his life. And I hope Robbie has been able to get back on the line. I know that his Zoom was having some challenges a few minutes ago, but let me just introduce him by saying that he's a Bentop patient and a trauma survivor. And his story really illustrates the stakes, and I think his perspective will help us all understand what the collective outrage we're seeing right now is really about. So Robert Tolan grew up in Bel Air, Texas, and it was there that he was shot by a Bel Air police officer on the front steps of his own home in front of his parents. And just to be clear, full disclosure, if you didn't hear Dr. Rosengart mention this, uh, uh, Mr. Tolan, or Robbie Tolan, is my cousin, so I will be addressing him as Robbie for the duration of this interview. Robbie, welcome. Were you able to get back on the line?
I'm here.
All right, great.
Good morning.
Good morning. So thanks very much for being with us and to be able to share your experiences with my colleagues. You didn't decide that you wanted to be an activist. This sort of happened to you, but thank you for being willing to share your story and really everything. So Robbie, to get started, why don't we, before we talk about what happened on December 31st, 2008, just tell me a little bit about your background. How would you describe your upbringing?
Sure. I grew up in a very loving home. My dad played 14 years in the major leagues, Major League Baseball. So I grew up in, affluent neighborhoods, had, access to some of the biggest baseball stars in the 90s, the Ken Griffey Jr.'s, the Tony Gwynn's, the Barry Bonds, um, guys like that. I grew up around those guys. Um, it was a home full of love and laughter, and I grew up going to good schools and like I said, living in affluent neighborhoods, things like that. Never really having any idea of the racial bias that existed in this country. Um, I was just one of those happy kids.
Mhm. So you would say you had a pretty good childhood, a pretty good upbringing, some
I think so.
pretty
Yeah,
good role models.
I think so. Looking up to to you in case. Yeah, sure,
All right.
absolutely.
Did you ever get in trouble, any legal trouble growing up?
No,
Okay.
never. Never was involved in anything illegal. Never got in any trouble. Um, in fact, I didn't even have a parking ticket um, up until the time before I was shot.
So speaking of that, why don't we go ahead and fast forward to December 31st, 2008. Um, tell us about what happened that night.
I went out to dinner with some friends, um, and then kind of hung out. Went to a pool hall, played some pool, hung out a little bit, and was coming home just after like 1 in the morning, I believe. And I turned on my street that I had lived on for at the time 15 years. By the way, I should mention that I went to Baylor High School, played baseball there all 4 years. Um, and for anyone that's from Houston, especially in the 90s and 2000s, you kind of have an idea about the you know the weight or the gravitas of the Baylor baseball team. I mean, they were normally nationally ranked. So I went to Baylor High School, played baseball there all 4 years, and lived in Bel Air at that house on Woodstock for 15 years at the time. And so I pulled up in front of my house that I had lived at for 15 years again. And my cousin Anthony and I, who was with me, we parked in front of the house on the street, and I opened the car door, turned the car off, opened the door, and I saw a set of headlights on the inside of my door. I turned around and I saw that it was a Baylor police officer behind me. Um, I wasn't afraid or nervous or worried. I hadn't done anything. So, and for a city like Bel Air with its own police department, it's not uncommon to see them up and down the streets at 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning. So I got my things out of the car and calmly walked up the driveway. I didn't run, I didn't panic or anything like that. So walked up the driveway, and I saw that the car had passed me. Excuse me. The car had passed me and made a U-turn in the cul-de-sac and parked. And so Anthony and I walked up the driveway and got to the front door. And then all of a sudden we heard, get on the ground. And, there was a flashlight in her face. And I looked and saw past the flashlight and saw that it was the police officer. The police officer had put his patrol vehicle nose to nose with mine in the front of the yard, or on the street rather. And I said, why? What do we do? And he said, we got a report of a stolen car. I said, no, sir, that's my car. This is my house. I have my ID. I can show you. And he said, I don't get on the ground. Get on the ground. And I said, sir, this is my car. I can show you my ID. This is my house. I live here. And he didn't want to hear it. He the more I tried to, identify myself, he said, he just got more and more agitated. So my parents, having just gotten home themselves, had from inside the house heard me, saying, that's my car, what do we do? So they themselves came outside. And so, Chad, you know this, but, we had a pane glass window in the front door. So I see them coming outside and I say, okay, well, Mom and Dad are about to come outside to fix everything. I'll go ahead and get on the ground. So I got on the ground, and Dad comes outside and he sees that, there's an officer with his gun out, and he throws his hands up immediately and says, oh, hey, what's going on? The officer says, we got a report that these two young men I can't remember how he phrased it, but these two guys or something like that were driving a stolen car. And he said, no, sir, that's our car. This is our house. That's my son. That's my nephew. We live here. And the officer snatched my dad and threw him up against the another car that was parked in the driveway at gunpoint. At which point my mom, she was saying, hey, this is a big mistake. You guys have made a big mistake. We live here. We've lived here for 15 years. Nothing like this has ever happened. This is our car. This is our son. At that point, unbeknownst to us, we learned later that the initial officer had been calling for backup pretty frantically. Oh, we've got these two car burglars, or however he put it. I can't remember. I have the audio somewhere. But he had been calling for backup pretty frantically. So the second officer, the responding officer, came in pretty hot, thinking, the other officer was in trouble. So he ran up the driveway and, came behind my mom and said, get against the wall. And my mom said, who, me? Like, this is my house. Like, I live here. That's my son, the whole thing. And he grabbed her so hard that she had bruises for several days and threw her against the wall. At which point I pushed myself up and said, get your hands off my mom. Without saying a word, he drew his gun and shot me in the chest.
Thanks, Robbie, for, I know it's painful and difficult to recount that story. I know you've had to tell it a bunch of times. Or for clarification, we subsequently learned that the first officer had ran your plates. And did they ever give a reason why they ran your plates?
The the reason that they gave us was that there had been a string of car burglaries in that 3 or 4 day span before New Year's Eve.
Mm-hmm.
So they were already on high alert, and he ran my plates and transposed the numbers. He ran the plates and he put the wrong license plate in, and it came up as a possible stolen car. So
Stolen sedan.
Correct. Correct. It was a stolen. It was the same make but different model, different color. I had an SUV. It came back as a sedan, right? And I've learned in recent year, or not recent years, but I've learned over the years and talking to other officers that once a car is flagged as a possible hit, you're then supposed to verify it by calling on your walkie-talkie, I guess, to dispatch. So, when police officers run license plates, they're often doing so while they're driving and typing it in, and they may hit a wrong key or something. So I've learned that they're supposed to then call it in while reading it to verify it, and he didn't do that.
So he ran your plates and then he miskeyed your plates. It came back as a stolen hit, and then he didn't really follow protocol. He decided to make a felony stop without verifying.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then thanks for telling us the rest of the story. So you said you were shot, and I know from there the EMS was called and was on the way. Did the officer interact with you at all after he shot you?
They took my parents and Anthony away immediately and put them in separate police cars. And then the officer that shot me came back to me, and he was digging in my pockets, and he was asking, where's the weapon? What were you reaching for? And obviously I didn't have a weapon. He didn't find anything. And then he called EMS.
So they brought you to Benton Hospital, and I'm sure that was one of the scariest moments of your life. Did you, when you were wheeled into our resuscitation area, did you think you were going to die?
Oh, of course. And in fact, when I was in the ambulance, I remember asking them with whatever breath I could muster, where are my parents? I wanted to be around my parents. I was scared. I was certain that I was going to die, and I wanted to spend those last moments with my parents. And in fact, even when I got into the OR, I guess, being stripped off my clothes, everything taken off of me, everyone around me, and I remember like confused, like what's going on, like wait, where are my parents? And I definitely thought I was going to die.
So just for since there's so many surgeons here, I want to just review your injuries and your course. So obviously, Dr. Maddox, and Dr. Maddox is on the line. Thank you, Dr. Maddox, for taking care of my cousin when this happened. So Dr. Maddox took you to the operating room right away for the gunshot wound for an exploratory laparotomy. You had a bad liver injury. They also put a chest tube in you. You had quite a significant hemothorax, but they were able to stabilize you. And how long were you in the hospital after that?
I think about 3 weeks. It felt longer, but I think about 3 weeks or maybe close to a month or something like that.
What was the recovery like?
uh, uh, well, in retrospect, it was pretty amazing. I had some great physicians that took care of me, and obviously about our amazing family. So I had an incredible support system, but it was tough, man. It was awful, especially as a professional athlete. You know what I mean? Just not being able to get up and do anything for myself. Go to the bathroom, walk. I mean, it was awful. It was tough.
Yeah, and what about more the emotional recovery?
Yeah, that I think was probably worse. Um, I was 23 at the time, so being a young, fit 23-year-old, I didn't feel like it, but my body healed pretty rapidly. But the emotional and psychological scars were tougher to handle. I got death threats. People saying that I got what I deserved, and oh, he should have stood over you and shot you in the head. That type of stuff. That was a little bit tougher, and I couldn't understand why these people that never met me or didn't know me um, wished that type of stuff on me. So up until that point, again, I really hadn't had any overt in your face racism or racial bias to that point. So that was really the toughest thing to deal with.
You essentially became a while you were in the hospital. Your story was on the news, and everyone in the city was basically talking about you and your case. And of course, some people were angry at the police for this mistake they made, but then there were people that were angry at you for basically daring to say that the police, were wrong to have shot you.
Sure. And it was especially impactful because there were on the same in the same 24 hours that I was shot, there were two other black men that were shot and killed by police in the country. One was a guy named Adolph Grimes in New Orleans, who was a uh, who was there visiting family. He had left during Hurricane Katrina and been living in Houston, I believe it was, and then he was going back for the holidays and got peppered with bullets going to his grandmother's house, and then a guy in Oakland named Oscar Grant, and those of you might remember the movie Fruitvale Station. That's the Oscar Grant story, and so he and myself and Adolph Grimes were shot in the same 24 hours by police, and those two didn't survive.
Yeah. So this time had actually ignited this conversation about profiling and racial bias by the police. So it can be hard to recover emotionally when you have to deal with journalists reaching out and seeing all these messages in your on the internet about you.
Sure.
Um, so thank you for sharing that part of your story. Now, Did the city of Bel Air or the police department, did they ever, like, how did they respond to this incident? Did they come to you and sort of apologize? And how did they respond?
Um, no, they didn't apologize. In fact, they doubled down. You know, our officers are excellent and they're, you know, trained well, and it's funny because the officer that the initial officer, Officer Edwards, was a 6-year veteran of the Bel Air Police Department. The one that shot me, Sergeant Jeffrey Cotton, was a 10-year veteran. And so I had been in Bel Air 15 years at the time and lived in that house, that same house, and went to Baylor High School. And, you know, even if you're not racially biased or you don't claim to be racially biased, you know, in a city of, you know, about 3,000 or so people, 3,500 people, at least in 2008, 2009, the population of Black residents was, I believe, like less than 2%. So even on accident, you knew where the Black people lived in Bel Air. And so I just think that's kind of, you know, funny, not haha funny, but ironic funny that, you know, we lived in that house for 15 years and they weren't rookies, you know, they were in the department. And so, yeah, no, they doubled down and said that their officers were, you know, had immaculate records, which they did not. No, I was offered no type of apology, no anything. They doubled down.
What about this sort of the general citizens of Bel Air? How would you say they responded? And, you know, what was the general sense in that community?
I only got messages or letters from people that were, to my knowledge, from people from neighbors that were on my street. You know, we got a lot of support from the neighbors. I don't know about outside of Woodstock Drive.
Yeah, but there was outrage in the city, but
Sure.
there really wasn't that much outrage in Bel Air, as I recall. That's a fair.
Correct. Yeah.
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 And how did that feel for the city, you know, the city you grew up in, having grown up in Bel Air and the community you lived in, having, you know, been a standout athlete on that baseball team and having been there so long? How did it feel to not have the community to not really kind of come to your support and sort of demand an explanation?
Not great. It didn't feel great. I'll be honest with you though. I didn't think too much about the support or lack thereof within the city of Bel Air. I was more so trying to heal physically and and psychologically and emotionally. And I was more so concerned about the letters that I was receiving from all over the country, and you know, obviously the death threats that I received from all over the country, um, uh, you know, kind of had an impact on that as well.
So the Officer Cotton, Sergeant Cotton, who shot you, was indicted, and the case went to criminal trial. What happened? What was the result of his trial?
He was acquitted. He was acquitted. He was found not guilty.
How did that make you feel?
Awful. You know, I mean, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, once everything comes out, you know, I can understand people that say, okay, well, let's wait for all the facts to come out before we form an opinion, before we, you know, judge or whatever. But then once they do, and you still choose to choose to ignore what happened, that's where I have a problem. And so the facts are this: I was at my own house. I was driving my own car. They made the mistake. I did not have a weapon. You know what I mean? That's it. That's all. Those are the facts. I did not have a license to carry. You know what I mean? It wasn't anything like that where he could have had a weapon. We were on high alert. They didn't even ask my name or ask for my ID or anything like that. So I mean, once those facts came out, to still choose to find him not guilty, I suffered a real blow with that one. Meanwhile, he was still on administrative leave with pay. Meanwhile, I, essentially lost my career.
Yeah. So to clarify, Robbie was playing professional baseball. He was in the minor leagues when this happened. Obviously, was unable to return to the field at least that season, and it obviously derailed his own attempts to follow in his father's footsteps and play in the major leagues. I just take as an aside. I was in Africa when you got shot, and I was living in Africa, but I was here for the trial, and I sat through it, and I don't feel like that officer came to work that day saying, I hope I get a chance to kill an innocent black kid. He wasn't guilty of that, but what I think what I and every other person who hears your case understands is that if this plays out 100 times, and 100 times the family in Bel Air is white, the plates are less likely to get run. They're more likely to confirm the stolen hit, and they're more likely to de-escalate and not escalate the situation. And finally, they're less likely to perceive you as a threat when you say, get your hands off my mother. It's that bias, it's that lack of training, that's what puts us at risk. And in fact, like I said, that happens 100 times with a white family. There's the probability of this outcome is lower than it is with a black family. And that's what systemic racism is. And that's what's so infuriating and frustrating. You can't prove it in any specific case that, yeah, this is why this happened, because this guy's a racist. It's just there's this pervasive bias that leaves us in a precarious position at all times, and it's never ending. Let me just finish with, we're in 2020, and we've obviously actually before I get to that, I do want to, if anybody who's listening wants to hear a lot more about the story, this is the book. You see it behind Robbie. It's actually a really good read. It's called No Justice, and you can actually get a lot more of the facts, and it's a fascinating story. It focuses on his childhood, his upbringing, the incident, but really mostly the legal process, which didn't just end with the criminal case, but it went on to a civil case as well, which there was some redemption through the civil process, but I would say still not really the justice that Robbie deserved. So Robbie, now in 2020, after you've lived through the deaths of so many people since your shooting, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, I mean, the list just goes on. And now Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, how do you feel, or what's your perspective? What's your life like now? Every time you have to hear about one of these incidents.
Before I answer, let me just give you a quick fun fact. I went to school with Sandra Bland at Prairie View. But, and you just showed my book. So the funny thing is, again, not ha funny, but ironic funny, is that when I began writing my book or began thinking about writing a book, I literally said these words. And I said, by the time I'm finished with this book, there probably won't even be like a need for the book. There won't even be a market for this book by the time I'm finished with it. And, boy, was I wrong, right? It seems to happen, seemingly every other week. And, on one hand, where I want to crawl under a rock and not be bothered and kind of hide and just, keep to myself. I've actually had the privilege of being or spending time and speaking with all of these families, the Trayvons and the Michael Browns and the Tamir Rices. In fact, Chad, you know this, but Michael Brown's mother and Tamir Rice's mother were just at my mom's house a few months ago. We have a relationship with these families, and to hear them speak about the pain of losing their child, I can't stay silent. It's not a role that I would have ever asked for. And I don't particularly enjoy it. But I have an obligation to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. And so that's where I'm at.
Robbie, thank you. Obviously, we've talked about this a bunch, but thank you for taking the time to have the same conversation we've had many times for this audience. And I can't tell you how valuable your testimony is for the hearts and minds of people who may not really understand what all of this means and how it impacts you, me, and really every Black person in this community.
Thank you so much for the two of you, for your bravery, for your transparency, for your willingness to take off the mask and give us even deeper meaning and context to our work at hand. As Dr. Rosengart said, this was riveting and speechless, very powerful. I can't imagine how difficult it was for both of you to be so transparent. There are many that have come forth, organizations as well as Dr. Klopman, in the last few weeks, compelling us to be a part of the solution. And so I think what we've heard today really does give us a foundation to move ahead for. So I say to the leadership in the Department of Surgery, thank you for your willingness to have this conversation. And we certainly have other things planned. Next week, we have a Compassionate Conversations where we will come together as a Baylor community and focus on this issue of police brutality, systemic racism, and hear and learn more. I mean, we have some things planned in terms of what we can do as an institution, what we're doing as an institution, as well as what we can do as individuals. But I just really do hope that people are able to attend. The Department of Surgery is co-sponsoring the 5:30 to 7 p.m. event, where Dr. Klopman and other institutional leaders will be there. but it's really meant to be an event for our community, for us to come together and figure out concrete actions so that we can implement and address racism and police brutality. Your two ambassadors are also on the Zoom, Dr. Chai and Dr. Provenza. They are very involved in this effort, and I look forward to partnering with everyone on the call as we move forward.